Good morning. This is the second part of the Introduction to Cultural Studies, and what I would like to talk with you today about is studying human society, that is the anthropology. We are going to take a historical perspective, a chronological perspective, and there will be a lot of name dropping today. Some of these names may be familiar to you, great. Some of them may be new. Don't worry, this is just to familiarize you with those scholars and especially concerning the newer ones and those who are also relevant for the study of literature. We will definitely talk about them some more. So this is one of the rare examples in which I will take the chronological approach, and I will basically give you a short overview of the history of anthropology, especially cultural anthropology. Otherwise, I prefer to focus on specific subjects rather than the history of something or chronology of something. But it's just to ground you more or less in the field. So, first of all, a little bit more about what anthropology is and what are other fields of scholarship that deal with studying human behavior, human social behavior especially. So the big umbrella term is anthropology, which means basically studying human behavior and societies. It can be further subdivided into cultural anthropology, so studying basically cultural variation among humans, social anthropology, so social behavior, social context of human behavior, linguistic anthropology, studying the role of language in social life, biological anthropology, so something about the biological development of humans, like early humans, for example. There are, in fact, other entire disciplines like archaeology, which is interested in studying physical evidence of past human cultures. So basically, looking for objects. Sociology, study of society, social interaction, and culture, very often in the contemporary, modern setting. Ethnology, comparison and analysis of different peoples. Peoples meaning groups of people, not individual people, but peoples, that is the groups, tribes, nations. And ethnography, a systematic study of peoples and cultures. So these are all elements of the general study of human society and human culture. There is also a term cultural studies used in a more narrow sense. This is quite important for the study of contemporary culture and especially the political dynamics, so the relations between culture, power, media, globalization. So this is something that became quite popular in the second half of the 20th century. It has a lot of relevance to the study of literature and modern culture, popular culture. We are definitely going to talk some more about it, but in general, when I talk about culture studies or cultural studies, I use the broader term, so studying human behavior. That's the narrow term. I will return to this at the end of today's lecture, but there you go. So things, relations of cultural phenomena to wider systems of power. So the connection between knowledge and power through ideology, class structure, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, globalization. As you can see, these are all quite relevant Subjects in the modern world also quite divisive and controversial. We are going to have a lot of controversy in this lecture series. For myself, I'll try to be impartial. Whatever your political views, you can keep them. I'm not going to preach to you in any way, but at least for now, show you the arguments when they arrive. Not today probably, but over the course of this semester, we are going to talk about some quite divisive issues. But as I said today, the history of anthropology, the history of studying human behavior, it's as old almost as human social behavior, at least in a more organized state. So from classical antiquity, you have the scholars such as Herodotus, the Greek scholar, Pausanias, the Roman scholar. You have great explorers and travelers such as Marco Polo in the 13th and 14th centuries. As you can see here, the map of his grand journey in the last years of the 13th century. So going from Venice through basically the breadth of Asia all the way to China, and then returning along the coast of Asia through India, through the Arab countries, back to Venice. So he was not a scholar, he was a merchant, but his travels and the book that he wrote about his travels became very influential. He was basically a keen observer, sometimes adding a bit of fantasy to his observations of the cultures that he encountered, and that's why he can be seen as a relevant historical source. Even as I said, not everything he wrote was completely true, but the stories are true in their own right. So it's not an exact science, and we'll talk about it perhaps a little bit more later. There is also quite a lot of philosophical background to studying human societies and human nature. Sorry, and in the next slide you have three philosophers from the 17th, 18th century. So basically philosophers connected with the Enlightenment, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And a very, very brief statements from each of those philosophers regarding human nature. So Thomas Hobbes very famously wrote that the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So the life in the natural state is very unpleasant, because, as he believed, humans are selfish. So it's the egoism of people that drives human nature, and it's the civilization that actually brings some order to this natural, primordial chaos of human nature. This is what Hobbes believed. Then we have John Locke, an English philosopher of the Enlightenment, who basically believed that human, is reasonable. So the people are not completely chaotic. They are reasonable in their thinking, and this is really the way that civilization can develop. He also believed very famously that children, when they are born, they are a blank slate. So in Latin, tabula rasa. So they are completely molded by the environment. They are born neutral, and they are molded by the environment. We'll talk about it when we talk about development of people and different theories about learning and development of people. The third philosopher here on the slide is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Again, a French language, he was Swiss, philosopher, sometimes believed to be the philosopher who inspired the French Revolution. As you can see, he died before it happened, so he was not instrumental in the revolution itself, but his thinking could be instrumental in the social changes that led to the French Revolution and basically to the formation of the modern world. And what he believed about nature is completely opposed to what Thomas Hobbes believed, because for Rousseau, nature was perfect, and human civilization, human meddling with nature, spoiled it for people, because, as he wrote, man is born free and everywhere he's in chains. So basically humans are oppressed by power, by civilization, by obligation, by social structures, and the freedom of people when they are born is very illusory. So as you can see, these are very polarized opinions, and especially if you think of Hobbes and Rousseau, they are on the two opposite sides of thinking of human nature, whether nature is very bad or perfect. Possibly something of both, and possibly, depending on the context, depending for whom, we'll maybe talk about it some more. But generally, as you can see, philosophy is basically the bedrock of any kind of humanist studies, so the same for anthropology and any kind of studies of human behavior. Then we have the evolutionary thought of the later 18th and then the 19th century, with the gradual development of knowledge about classification of plants and animals, first postulated by Carolus Linnaeus, a Swedish biologist, then through different scholars following in his study of the natural world. So Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who studied the adaptive force in nature, so how organisms adapt to their environment. We of course have Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. Earlier there was an interesting scholar called Thomas Malthus, who is sometimes believed to be the father of demography, that is studying human population. He was the first scholar to ever think of people in terms of population studies, so groups of people, the dynamics of the development of people. He actually believed that if people continue to multiply at the rate they did, the earth would not be able to feed them all. He was perhaps not completely correct, especially in the 18th century, in the 19th, early 19th century, but he is sometimes referred to when modern discussion of human population, especially the rapid growth of the population, is mentioned. Another one is the follower of Darwin, Herbert Spencer, who coined the phrase survival of the fittest. So it wasn't Darwin who came up with this phrase, it was Herbert Spencer in the next generation. So not only evolution, but also the principle that the best adapted organism will survive and the rest will become extinct. And he believed that human societies basically obey the law of nature. So evolution and the theory of progress applies to them as well. But just as with natural evolution in Darwinian sense, it is the progress of the species rather than individual progress of individual people. This leads us to the beginning of anthropology, Victorian anthropologists. One of them you have met already, Edward B. Taylor. He was an evolutionary anthropologist, so he wanted to map the distribution of different elements of culture. This is something that Victorian scholars were fascinated by, how in different cultures or in different religions you have similar motives. This is something that will be very important for the study of symbols in culture, and it really goes back to the 19th century and the first attempts to map the distribution of different elements of culture by people like Taylor or James George Fraser, another very influential anthropologist. And his major book, The Golden Bough, Złota Gałąź in Polish, is still read as a historical document, as a glimpse into the Victorian scientific mind. He was mostly interested in finding similarities between various religions and symbols, and he believed in this progress principle, so from magic to religion, then to science, so in a very Darwinian sense, kind of evolution of social structures, evolution of human spirituality. This has been questioned by scholars nowadays, but I've read The Golden Bough. It's a fascinating read, even though he was not entirely correct, and he never went on field trips. He basically sat in the library and read books about different cultures and different religions and symbols. So it's not exactly correct, but interesting in its own right as a book, as some sort of linkage between fiction and the science book. So if you ever have a chance of reading that, and if you're interested in the studying of human behaviors, it's still interesting, even if you need to take it with a bit of skepticism, with a grain of salt, and not believe everything you read. Of course, the methodological and factual errors are not the only dark sides of anthropology. There are some things that resulted from this Victorian anthropology that were quite questionable morally, if you think about that. One of such things would be the concepts, the late 19th, early 20th century concepts of scientific racism, which tried to link the biological differences between people adapted historically to different conditions on Earth to some sort of intellectual and moral aspects of their behavior. Here we have an illustration from the book which tries to prove, as you can see, that basically the English, and especially as they call it the Anglo-Teutonic, so the Anglo-Saxons, are better and more intelligent and more handsome and generally more adapted to modern society than any other type of people. Not only people of other skin colors, like here we have a dark-skinned person, but also people of different ethnic origin, like this Irish Iberian, who's probably meant to signify the Celtic background rather than the Anglo-Saxon background. This pseudoscience was used as the justification of neo-imperialism, especially in Africa. So of course it had nothing to do with facts and reality. It was basically the political use of anthropology. Another such thing was the pseudoscience, another pseudoscience of eugenics. And there were quite a lot of rather influential proponents of this way of thinking. Among them Francis Galton, a relative of Charles Darwin, and George Bernard Shaw, the Nobel Prize winning writer. They believed that the evolution of the human species could be hastened by conscious, rational element in encouraging some people to reproduce more and discouraging some people from reproduction altogether. So here we have a fragment of an early 20th century poster which says only healthy seed must be sown, and shows the farmer sowing the seeds in the field, but of course here it's meant in a more symbolic sense. So basically only the best people should reproduce for the human species to develop further. Of course, as hopefully you can see it even now, whoever is to decide who is the best, that was one of the reasons that this whole science was completely disproved, and also why it was used or abused by totalitarian states. This is something that was partially inspirational for the Nazis and the concentration camps. So this is really what the abuse of anthropology can cause. And if you think it's completely in the past, not quite. Here we have a cartoon from the press in which two people, as you can see, elderly people from probably wealthy middle class background, somewhere in the Western civilization, discuss social Darwinism. And what is social Darwinism? It is the survival of the richest. So does it really mean that people with more wealth are better adapted to the society and to the environment, and they should survive? Probably not. So here you can see the potential problems with the study of anthropology, and something perhaps to be wary about. And let's now move to the overview of the history of studying human society. So we are moving from the 19th century onwards. Just a very short introduction to the most important scholars, to the most important names, which may be useful to you in the continuation of your studies, so as you'll see in a little moment. So the first name on the list is Lewis Henry Morgan, an American scholar from the late 19th century, the man who also believed in evolutionary perspective. He believed in the progress of societies from what he called savagery to barbarism to civilization, so the development in stages. He was basically coming from the archaeology background, and he studied material evidence of ancient cultures, especially in Native American cultures. He got especially interested in the ethnography of the Iroquois tribe in America. He was one of the first Western scholars to study systematically Native American societies. As you can see, in the late 19th century, they were still quite prominent in America. He even got accepted as member of the tribe, so they were not only happy to welcome him as a scholar, but he was appreciated as the man who, according to the Iroquois themselves, understood their culture well enough to be the kind of honorary member of the tribe. But if we look at the late 19th and early 20th century, the influence on culture is basically divided by two great geniuses, great, controversial, wildly criticized and popularly hated men, Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. One of them was a philosopher, economist, political theorist. The other one was the psychologist, the father of psychoanalysis. But their influence is felt everywhere, not only in their original fields of study, but in the study of culture, in the study of literature, in the study of popular culture, film, and basically any aspects of human behavior. And you probably heard about these two great men, but what makes them so influential and so widely disputed even now is probably that they were quite reductionist. They presented relatively simple characterizations of what makes human culture tick. For Marx, it was, to make it very, very, very simplistic, it was all about the money. Money and conflict. For Sigmund Freud, it was all about human relations, psychological conflict, very often pertaining to sexual matters. So that's the great divide, that's the great discrepancy, because it's either money or sex. And as you will see, even in the course of this semester, this is a relevant discussion for any kind of study of culture, and especially modern culture in the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries. There will be some scholars who will choose one perspective, so either this kind of economical perspective, political perspective, or the very psychological and even spiritual perspective, dealing predominantly with the internal world of the human mind. There will be some who will try to reconcile these two realities. But before we do, let's look at a very simple introduction to the theories of Marx and Freud. I hope it's not entirely new for you. If it is, don't worry, you'll hear this thing often enough. It may be a good idea to Google some more, to try to read some more. This is something I would generally encourage you to do. If you find something interesting, try to do a little internet search, or find some more information, find some more texts or films or essays on those subjects. So let's look at Marx's theory. And here we have this pyramid diagram, a little bit similar to Maslow's pyramid of the hierarchy of needs. And the plane. Oh dear, it will pass in a moment. And if we look at the division of this pyramid, we have base and superstructure. So if we compare it to Maslow's pyramid, it's like the primary needs, the biological and fundamental needs of the humans. For Marx, it was the economy. So basically, the means of survival, the means of security, the social structures, the structure of work that makes human life bearable or not. And only if this level is satisfied, we can move to superstructure. So all the social functions, all the social institutions, such as government, family, religion, education, culture. So basically, it's a bit like Maslow. You first have to eat, and then you will look for any other forms of fulfillment, either material or intellectual or emotional fulfillment. So Marx very importantly proposed a materialist interpretation of reality. He did not believe in religion, he did not believe in any spiritual reality. He believed that whatever exists is what we can see, what we can find around in the material world. So this is something very important. That's why we are only left with the people and the relationships between the people. And also he believed, and this is something that all further generations of all kinds of activists take from him, the purpose of philosophy is not to understand the world, but to change it. So philosophy just for the sake of intellectual pleasure is futile. He believed that the purpose of philosophy is to change the world, is to make people aware of their situation and show them the means to change the situation. And for Marx, as he wrote in his most influential books, The Communist Manifesto and Capital, he very often worked with his best friend, Friedrich Engels. We'll talk about Engels later on. They wrote most of it together, so basically, but I think it was Marx's ideas that were dominant in this teamwork. So for Marx, the most important thing about society, and as you can remember, he observed the society of Victorian Britain. He was German by birth, but he moved to London. He tried to make a living in London. It was very hard for him. He was very poor. He basically survived thanks to his friend Friedrich Engels. But he could see Britain, which was then the most technologically advanced civilization in the world, but with all the problems and all the horrors of the capitalist society. So great wealth of the owners of factories, of the aristocracy still, but also those new money, and great poverty and degradation of the workers. So this was the new world, with the middle class forming, with the working class forming in the modern sense, and this is something that Marx observed, and he was completely horrified by these social relations, and he believed that the most important thing about the world that he lived in, so Victorian England, is class conflict. and that capitalism, so the system of economy that started to really dominate in the West at this time, was all about class conflict. The conflict between those who had the means of production, who controlled the workers, and the workers themselves. He used the terms bourgeoisie, which means basically the middle class, the rich middle class, those who control the factories, the means of production, those who are employers in this system, and on the other hand, proletariat, which means the working class, the workers, and those who are basically at the mercy of this whole system, and the bourgeoisie. And this is the internal conflict. This is the central conflict of the modern world for Marx. What he believed would happen is the revolution. He believed it would basically lead to the revolution. And he kind of tried to imagine what would happen after the revolution. He believed the society would move away from capitalism towards more socialist state, and eventually it will reach the communist state, in which some of the fundamental things for the capitalist society, such as private property, would not apply. If we read the Communist Manifesto, he doesn't really have a clue how such society should look and how it could prosper, but the identification of the class conflict and generally conflict between the oppressed and the oppressors in different ways in modern society, it's the lasting legacy of Marxist theory. So it will very quickly, as you'll see later on, move from economy to other areas of social life. And the second great theory of the turn of the 20th century is the theory of Sigmund Freud. And what he studied was the human psyche. He wrote several books. You have some titles here: The Interpretation of Dreams, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the Ego and the Id. And he was a practicing psychologist, a practicing psychoanalyst, dealing with clients or patients, so people with some sort of psychological problems. And he based his observation on the observation of his patients. And basically he developed the theory of the human mind, which again has been questioned by many scholars since. And if we look at it, especially from the modern perspective, it has several flaws. One of the major flaws is that first of all, he mostly dealt with people with severe psychological problems. So it is questionable whether his observations apply to people who do not have such problems. Another thing, perhaps even worse, is he was mostly interested in boys and men. So it's very debatable to what extent and with what precision his findings are applicable to girls and women. So these are big questions that were tackled by later generations of scholars. But the general idea, first of all, that human psychology, human mind, is not a monolith. It's not something which is set in stone. I think it's still relevant, and the importance of human psychological reality to culture in general. So what we have here is a picture of a symbol of the iceberg, with the tiny tip of the iceberg, which is visible above the water, as the conscious part of the mind. Ideas, thoughts, feelings of which people are aware. And as you can see, much more is below the surface of the water. Even parts of the ego, the self, the part of the psyche with which we interact with the world every day, some of it is not necessarily conscious. It could be kind of pre-conscious, so it could be recalled if necessary, but not everything is conscious all the time. You can also see the subconscious or unconscious parts of the human psyche here. So parts of the ego again, but also superego and id, which means superego is like the ideal, the moral guardian, the internalized social voice, the internalized voice of, I don't know, the idealized father perhaps, or the society in general, some sort of moral guardian that could be seen as a voice of conscience, could be seen as a voice of the oppressive part of social structures. So this is something that tries to keep the ego in check. But there is also the third part called the id, which Freud calls the pleasure principle. So the site of unconscious urges and desires. It's like the internalized baby, not even a small child, the unconscious baby, which is operated by instincts, by fears, by desires, which can throw a tantrum, which basically is a very chaotic part of the human psyche, but at the same time the most creative and the most able to enjoy life. So we need all these parts together, and we need for them to work together. What is the role of the unconscious for Freud? It is the place of fears, unacceptable desires, shameful experiences, selfish needs, immoral or violent urges, so everything that the society does not accept. It doesn't mean it does not exist, but usually in many people it is actually pushed into the unconscious. What Freud was interested in is the psychosexual development of children, especially, as I said, boys. So some of these theories have been disproved, but some of them are so influential that they are still discussed in culture, in art. They are still seen as an expression of something relevant. So he first of all believed that the human development goes through stages. The stages of the development, even in the infancy. So first of all, the moment when children are born and they are all focused on the feeding process, on the mouth and the interaction with the breast of the mother or the bottle, or basically the feeding. Then there is the phase of potty training, and basically children are more interested in the other side of the feeding process, so the elimination of waste. And then they start discovering their sexual organs, and this is for Freud the kind of model of development for every human, and especially a boy. So what he developed, what he described in his books, is what he called the Oedipus complex, based on classical mythology, the story of a boy who had a curse. And the curse was, when he was born, the prophecy was that he would kill his father and marry his mother. And in the myth, this is what happens, despite the best efforts of the boy. So Freud believed that myths are telling very important psychological stories, and this is the story of the human development, especially the development of a small boy. So he believed, and whether or not it is true, or whether it's not, or not it is even possible to say whether it's true, it's still very relevant culturally. So you have a lot of books and films and other texts of culture dealing with that. So we have the internalized conflict with the father. It's like the jealousy of the boy for the mother. The boy loves his mother and he is jealous of the father. So the whole conflict, which for Marx was basically an economic conflict, for Freud it is the internal psychological conflict a young man has with his father. So it's like the new baby-like aspects of culture have with the old established super-ego aspects of culture. This is all connected with what he calls life and death drives. So the impulses in the human psyche towards creation and destruction, and everything that goes in the human mind and everything that goes in culture is somehow related to that. So that's very, very short introduction to those two grand theories, the theories that are still relevant, even though, let me stress again, they have been partially contested. But the fact that they are still discussed, in my opinion at least, proves the fact that they are still really relevant. So let's now look at the further stages of development of the anthropological study. So back to anthropology, and there will be some name dropping here in quick succession. Don't get discouraged, probably you'll hear these names later on again. If you get interested, I'm just giving you a very, very brief introduction to each of those scholars and the importance of those scholars. If you want, just Google their names and you'll find quite a lot of information about them. Also in the books that I mentioned, which are uploaded for you in Moodle, you'll find more information about these scholars. So the first one here is again an American, Franz Boas, a very influential American anthropologist. He was one of the scholars who believed in cultural relativism, so they were against this fixation of Western culture on judging all other cultures and especially cultures of different origin. He basically studied the Inuit, so the people of the far north. He was against all forms of determinism and hierarchy of cultures. He strongly opposed the pseudosciences such as scientific racism, which I talked about a while ago. He debunked craniometry, so this kind of pseudoscience which believed that the physical structures of human skulls reflected the differences in human intellectual, psychological, moral ability. So he believed it was completely wrong. He was strongly against what he called armchair anthropology, so the Victorian attitude that you just need to study the objects and the books about different cultures to know everything about them. He believed in empiricism, so basically going on expeditions, going on field trips, speaking to the people whose culture you study. This is something very important for generally for the study of human culture that starts to be really relevant in the early 20th century and later. So empirical attitudes, studying asking the people that you study about their opinions. He was a mentor of the two anthropologists that we are going to talk about in a little moment, Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead. Also some other, like the whole generation of anthropologists such as Alfred Kreber or Edward Sapir. Alfred Kreber studied Native Americans, especially the rituals of Native Americans. Edward Sapir also studied Native Americans, but mostly through the perspective of language, and you may hear his name again in linguistics classes because he was part of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is basically the kind of theory that your language forms or influences your perception of the world. This is the very, very famous example of the Inuit people having various words for snow. Like in our culture, in our geographical zone, we do not have so many words for snow, so we do not perceive the small changes between different variations of snow. If it was more prominent in our culture, we would have more words for it, and those cultures that have more words for it, they actually result in people perceiving these things better. So that's something that's not only valid for anthropology but for linguistics and other studies as well. So Ruth Benedict, one of the students of Franz Boas, again the proponent of cultural relativism, that is studying each culture independently, not judging cultures, not forming hierarchies or some moral judgments of different cultures. Her main book is called Patterns of Culture from the 1930s. He basically studied Native Americans, mostly from the south of the northern part of America, so Pueblo cultures. He quite famously compared cultures to personalities, and just like each human personality chooses from a broad variety of possibilities, the same happens for cultures. They choose, as she wrote, from the great arc of human potentialities. So there are different ways of organizing societies, there are different ways of organizing, I don't know, belief systems, rituals, and other things. And each culture chooses those that they find most relevant. So it's like choosing from a vast array of potentialities. Margaret Mead was a student of both Frank Boas and Ruth Benedict, so she continued their work. And she became a very famous kind of media anthropologist in the interwar period, mostly for her study of sexuality in tribal societies, especially New Guinea, Samoa. Her main book was called Coming of Age in Samoa, and she went there, she talked to the people, she spent some time among them, and she came to a conclusion that first of all, human nature is very adaptable, and that the upbringing and social cultural conditions are more important even than the kind of physiology, biology. So she believed that in Samoa, people, young people, teenagers, before they married and entered the kind of rigid social structures, they had a period of relative freedom, especially marked by sexual experimentation. So this was this kind of free sex myth, which the American, especially more conservative American public found very scandalous, but at the same time very exciting. So her book became very influential beyond the field of anthropology. So there was this dream of the kind of paradise somewhere in the tropical islands where men and women, especially young men and women, are free to engage in intimate relations without any power structure behind it. Actually, this probably was not true, and in the 1980s, a younger scholar called Derek Freeman went to Samoa to talk to some of the women that Margaret Mead studied, and those women who were then very elderly, they thought, oh no, we were only joking. There was this funny white woman who came to study us, and we would just make up stories and tell her anything that we felt like telling her, and it wasn't like that. It was never like that, and we were just laughing our heads off that she believed us. So you may find that there is a documentary about this whole controversy, and we may assume that Margaret Mead really believed her respondents, but perhaps it was all those young women pulling her leg. We will never know. But even if it was not factually true, the book and the scholarship of Margaret Mead became very influential for culture, for American culture, and generally Western culture in the interwar period. She is one of the most quoted anthropologists. There is this story, it's probably not true, it's one of those stories that are quite symptomatic even if they are not fully true. There is this story that you may sometimes hear regarding Margaret Mead, that she was asked by one of her students what she believed was the first moment of humanity, like when humans started creating culture, and then those early humans, and the student probably believed that she would say something about tool use or some sort of the use of fire or something, and she said that for her it was when they found a skeleton of the early human with a healed bone. So apparently somebody broke their bone, and they were not left to die, and they were not left to become, the dinner of the predators, but they were healed and nurtured by the members of their tribe. So for her, the important moment, the groundbreaking moment in human development was the moment when humans started caring for the weaker. Again, probably she never said this, but this is something that she could have said, and something that added to the cultural relevance of anthropology as the field of study. So it's still quite important, not only historically but through the cultural influence. The next person here on the slide is a Polish-British anthropologist, Bronisław Malinowski, who also believed in participatory observation, so against the armchair studies. He definitely believed, like, if you want to study a culture, first thing you should do is to learn the language and do the field work and definitely adopt a skeptical attitude. Do not believe everything that the people tell you. So do not fall prey to pranks like Margaret Mead, basically, but stick to the facts. He didn't believe in Marxist idea of conflict as basis of culture, but rather in cooperation and consensus. So coming to some sort of cooperation and alleviating conflict for culture to develop. He believed that social and cultural institutions serve basic human needs. So basically utilitarian attitude. He called it functionalist anthropology. So the social structures, social institutions such as the state, such as the family and other, they are there because people and human groups find them useful. His main book, here we have the Polish title, Życie seksualne dzikich. The English language title was The Sexual Life of Savages in Northeastern Melanesia. So it's one of those titles that everybody knows, even though not many people read the book. In fact, there is very little about sexuality in the book, but he was probably trying to attract the same audience as Margaret Mead. He is quite important because of his influence on the later generations, and especially Emile Durkheim, that you'll see in a little moment. He is still relevant in this sense, and as you can see, there is a trend definitely moving away from armchair studies to participation and field work and skepticism in studying human society in general. The next one is an Australian anthropologist, Vere Gordon Childe, and he is quite important. He was British, and Australia was definitely very closely linked to Great Britain. He was most interested in, again, the evolution and the development of early human societies, and he believed in what he called the kind of revolution theory. So Neolithic revolution, then the urban revolution, and then in the late 18th century, the Industrial Revolution, rather than going with the traditional division from the 19th century, here proposed by a Victorian scholar, Christian Thompson, which is still sometimes used: the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. Childe was especially relevant in the studies made in the Orkneys, so the archipelago of the northern coast of Scotland, and especially the discovery and studies of the Neolithic site called Skara Brae, which we may end up talking about. So what we have is trying to make sense of the world, trying to make sense of the human society, to see the evolution or the kind of revolution. It really depends on how you see this development. The next one is Emile Durkheim, French sociologist and structuralist anthropologist. So social institutions seen as objective and autonomous social facts. So he believed that society has more influence on people than people have on society. So when you are born in the society, you are really influenced in your development, in your way of thinking, in your functioning as a human being more by the fact that you are born into the society than the society is by each individual who lives in it. So one of the books he wrote, and we are going to discuss it later on when we talk about modernity, was trying to answer the question why, at least in his view, towards the end of the 19th century, there was a rapid rise in suicide. So why people took their own lives, and what changed in the society that resulted in such a change. We'll talk about it when we talk about modernity. So he believed in one of the concepts developed by the followers of Freud, especially Gustav Jung, the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is the hypothesis that there are some symbols in the human psyche that are shared by all people, and they are expressed mostly through mythologies, different myths around the world. So Durkheim actually believed in this theory. We will talk about Jung and collective unconscious when we talk about mythology and myths. He believed this is a relevant factor, and that it is strengthened by upbringing, and of course social upbringing mostly. He is quite important as a mentor, as a teacher of, again, a whole generation of scholars, such as Marcel Mauss, who is very important for the concept of potlatch, which was a Native American custom of gift giving and exchanging gifts, so reciprocity and gift exchange. Google this word, it's quite incredible, and it describes a very strange social custom in which people or groups of people trying to kind of win in this sort of race of exchanging gifts. Like, if you receive a gift, you need to give a better one, and this could lead to some dramatic stories. And three more scholars, Alfred Radcliffe Brown, and his idea, again, he was a structuralist. Structural functionalism was the attitude he started, in which society was seen as a stable, self-regulating system. There were also some more scholars, mostly dealing with study of religions, tribal religions, primitive religions as they called them still. So Edward Evans Pritchard and Mary Douglas, the concepts of pollution and the danger. So basically we have much more interest in Durkheim and his students in the ritualistic side of social behavior, in religions, in customs, rather than institutions, let's say. The last one before we move to the very modern world is again a French scholar, Claude Lévi-Strauss. He combined two approaches, so Durkheim's sociology and the linguistic approach of Ferdinand de Saussure, and this is the name that you are definitely going to hear in the linguistic classes. He was the linguist who tried to define the language. So how does the word spoken relate to the object of the language? So if we have a word, how does it relate to the object? Is there an object, or are there only words? So it's a very important modern discussion of language, and if it's the first time you hear the name Ferdinand de Saussure, keep it at the back of your head because it will pop up. Claude Lévi-Strauss believed that humans are part of the structure. So structure rules human behavior. Structuralism generally is looking for structures in the world, either material world or the world of ideas and concepts. He was, of course, more interested in ideas and concepts, so he believed that social life is based on a system of symbols coded in the subconscious. So it's like the memes, which you may remember from last week, but the units of myth, which he called mythems. And these are shared by all people, coded in the human subconscious. He believed that human nature is unchanging. It's just the material reality and the technologies that change. His most famous book, probably Structural Anthropology, it's the biggest one, but also some titles here. The one on top is actually very often left untranslated. Triste Tropiques. It means the sadness of the tropics. It's like a story about a scholar who goes to Africa and he dreams of finding the paradise, and he finds basically people having all kinds of problems, psychological and social problems like everywhere else. A very interesting and rather sad story. So we continue in a moment. This leads us to the last part of the historical interview, overview of anthropology, and again, some of the names, many of the names will be relevant in the course of this semester and probably will pop up when you study literature, because the philosophy and ideas of these scholars are still very relevant to the study of culture, art, artistic expression. So the first one, it's a group rather than one scholar. The founders of critical theory, the Frankfurt School. Again, a very controversial and very divisive group of scholars, mostly from the German background. The group was founded in Frankfurt in Germany before the Second World War, but when the Nazis came to power, all of these scholars, most of whom had Jewish background, had to escape from Germany. They mostly went to the United States of America. Some of them remained there even after the war ended. And here we have some names of those scholars: Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm. They were philosophers, they were anthropologists in a way, sociologists in a way, cultural scholars in a way. They wrote about all kinds of things, including music, popular culture, literature, philosophy. We'll definitely talk about them some more. They were inspired by Marx, and they are sometimes called neo-Marxists because they generally took Marx's idea that conflict is the basis of the modern world and modern society, but they moved it beyond the work environment and the economy. So it's more about all kinds of oppressive social structures, mainly those that are driven by ideology, any kind of ideology. Could be capitalist ideology, could be any other ideology. And because most human social structures have this philosophical or ideological background, they believed that basically that's the main source of conflict. structures such as work, of course, but also school, also religion, also family, also the state. So they are sometimes seen as quite anarchist scholars. So that's why, rather than have the small images of their faces, this is one of the slogans connected with the Frankfurt School. It is forbidden to forbid, because that's oppression. Very relevant, even though, as you can see, none of these people are still alive. Very, very relevant to the modern world. So one of the central concepts of the Frankfurt School is the concept of hegemony. They took it from an earlier philosopher, or kind of political philosopher, an Italian anti-fascist called Antonio Gramsci. And hegemony, this is something that we will definitely return to, but the concept of hegemony is basically the exertion of power through cultural means. So power not really as a result of force or violence, but through cultural domination. This is something that will be very important. So main concepts for Frankfurt School scholars were capitalism, entertainment culture, very often seen in the negative light as forms of social control. So pop culture could be seen as the kind of drug to make people more passive. Authoritarian personality, this is something that we'll definitely return to. These men had the experience of the Nazis. They had the experience of the Holocaust, even if they did not die, but their families, their friends, very often were affected by the Holocaust. So one of the first questions they started asking after the war was, how on earth was it possible? So what kind of human, social structures made it possible for the Nazis to come to power, and for normal people to commit such atrocities? So basically another recurrent theme is tradition is oppressive. So tradition, meaning religion, family, also sexual morality, is oppressive, and people should strive for freedom. As you will see, this will be behind the student revolutions of the 1960s and the counterculture, and much of what's happening in culture today is somehow related in a positive or negative sense to the Frankfurt School. The next slide, Marvin Harris, American scholar, one of the proponents of cultural materialism. And as you can see, he develops Marx's idea of base and superstructure, adding another layer. So we have the infrastructure, the structure, and the superstructure. So it's again like this kind of pyramid. The infrastructure at the bottom with the material environment, then the structure, that is the social relations within a group, and the superstructure proper, meaning all the symbolic aspects of the culture, like art, ritual, science, and so on. He is quite well remembered for what he called the emic and ethic approaches, which is the division of whose perspective are we talking about. So the emic approach is how local people, the people you are studying, think, the perspective of the subject of study. And on the other hand, the ethic approach is what the researcher thinks, so the scientist oriented. So of course there is place for both, but you just need to be conscious of that. And the image here the illustration of the difference in these approaches by I think an Indian story about 6 blind men who found an elephant, and each of them was touching a part of an elephant and trying to describe this animal to the rest of the group. So the one who touched the trunk of the elephant, he said it's kind of a long tube, perhaps like a kind of long snake. Then the other man touched the tusk, so he said it's sharp and pointy. Another one touched the leg, so he said it's kind of big and massive, like a tree trunk. Another one touched the body of the elephant, so it was like something huge and large. So basically what it all boils down to is that none of them was lying, but because of their limitations, because they could only perceive a part of the whole elephant, they were limited in their understanding of the whole animal. So you just need to combine. Probably you need somebody with eyesight, talking to all of them and looking at the elephant, perhaps to recombine these elements into a whole. Then we have Clifford Geertz. You met him already. He was one of the authors of one of the modern definitions of culture. He was an American scholar, mostly again interested in symbols, symbolic anthropology. He popularized two concepts, basically borrowed from other scholars. He developed them. The concept of six descriptions, so kind of description that takes into consideration all the symbolic meanings of something, and family resemblances from which is just remarked upon by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, which means some sort of similarities between symbols and concepts in culture. So here we have a little quotation from Geertz. The analysis of what he's writing about is webs of significance in which man is suspended. It's not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. And this is true for all the anthropologists and cultural scholars that are interested in symbols, in structures. It's really pushing anthropology towards a humanist field of study rather than some sort of natural science. So it's not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning, just like philology, for example. So you have a text and you interpret it rather than doing experiments in search of some sort of rules behind it. Next one, Pierre Bourdieu, a French scholar, quite important for his concepts of habitus, for example, so the acquired system of dispositions, so some sort of rules, the schemes of perception and action, and most of all the concept of capital, which he takes from Marx but develops further. So it doesn't have to be the economic capital, but especially social and cultural capital. So if you hear anyone talking about social capital, like meaning like who you know, your web of contacts, or cultural capital, which is the cultural influences that you were subjected to in terms of manners, clothes, cars, education, aesthetic taste, books, paintings, whatever. This is as important for your cultural status as the money that of course Marx would propose. So the concept of capital, according to Pierre Bourdieu, is still valid, but it goes way beyond the economy. And what he also believed is that social order is based on prestige, not just material status. So it's not really about the class struggle, but struggle for symbolic domination. So for example, you can have symbolic violence, which is the imposition of symbols, connected to the concept of hegemony by Gramsci, if you remember. So if it's all new to you, if that's the first time in your life you hear about these names, don't worry, they will come back. It's just to familiarize you with these names. So just two more slides. One is going back to cultural studies as this narrower sense. This is mostly the group of scholars surrounding the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies that was active in the second half of the 20th century. The scholars that were most important for this center were Richard Hogarth and Stuart Hall, and what this group is remembered for in our field and the field of studying culture and literature is the concept of text not being only limited for written language. So anything can be a text of culture. This is the concept that was first introduced by Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. So a television program, film, fashion, clothes, photographs, spaces like, I don't know, beaches or gardens or pubs, all these things can become texts of culture and can be studied just as any story, okay? Because they are imbued with symbolic meaning. They would spend a lot of time dealing with modern popular culture, so things like globalization, post-colonialism, cultural consumption, feminism, so all the problems of contemporary modern life. So that's the kind of narrower sense of cultural studies. And the last concept with some more names, and these names are definitely going to come back, is the concept of postmodernism. So the most important aspect of postmodernism, and we are definitely going to spend a lot of time talking about what postmodernism is and how it is different from, let's say, modernism that was before it. Something that is seen as one of the defining features is something introduced by a scholar called Richard Rorty, something that he called the linguistic turn. And this was the realization, the idea that reality is knowable only through language. So language both describes and constructs reality. This is working a bit on the development of Sapir-Whorf theory. So your language influences the way you perceive reality. This is taken much farther. So that's why the term postmodernism is sometimes so divisive and so controversial, because what these scholars were basically saying is that there is only language. We cannot know reality. We only can approach it through language, and that's it. And language is very often connected to power structures. So we have, of course, probably the greatest name of these all, Jacques Derrida and his concept of deconstruction. His use, again, borrowed from another philosopher, his use of the concept of the other. So we have the self and the other, and the construction of the self is possible only through the symbolic construction of the other. Like, you cannot know what, let's say, to be Polish means, unless you compare it with not Polish. You cannot know what being, I don't know, tall is, unless you compare it with being short. So the creation of the figure of the other, the symbolic opposition in the construction of one's identity. We have Michel Foucault and his concept of discourse. Discourse means the way of speaking. Usually the way of speaking of some important subjects, subjects relating to power structures. This is what he was most interested in his work. The places like a school or a hospital or a lunatic asylum that would distribute knowledge but at the same time impose power. We have Jean Baudrillard, a very important scholar of postmodernism, who came up with the concept of the simulacra. It means it's like the copy of the copy. We do not have originals in our world. We just have the copies and the copies of copies, and this is all we have. If that's the first time you hear it, don't worry. This is just the introductory course. You have at least 3 years to study all these concepts, and they will come back again. Don't you worry. 2 more names before we stop, and this time these are 2 women scholars. One is Julia Kristeva and her concept of abjection. Abjection means revulsion, something that is pushed away as something disgusting perhaps in culture, or too drastic or too shocking, but at the same time it is interesting and perhaps fascinating as the object of study, precisely because it is so disgusting. We'll come back to that. The last one, and definitely we are going to meet her again, is Judith Butler, one of the grand scholars of feminism and also queer theory, so the perception of culture through the lens of non-heterosexual people. For example, what she's remembered for is the concept of gender performativity. So the way in which gender, that is social presentation of sexuality, is transferred and is strengthened by the social roles that people learn to adopt from early childhood. We'll talk about this more when we talked about the body and gender issues, but some of you who are more interested in political discussions of the day, you probably know these names, and these are the wolves of the modern cultural and political discussions, and we're going to meet them again, and you'll see perhaps the wolves are not that scary. So that's it for today, and see you next time.